Freedom to worship God comes from God, and no one can take that away from us. We may find ourselves in situations where we are subject to people who don't believe in God or who don't value our desire to worship. However, that cannot stop us. It's always important to understand and remember that God is in control and God has the ability to work things out for you. And all we have to do is trust Him and understand that we were created to worship Him. And we should never allow anything to stand between us and worshiping God. As always, I'm so glad to be here for the Sunday School Renaissance. This week's subject is freed to worship. And again, we're talking about the children of Israel as they were in exile. Now, last week, we talked about King Cyrus, the Persian king who kind of initiated everything and gave them the permission to go back and start building the temple. And like I said last week, King Cyrus was a pagan king. They did not worship the true and living God, but God used Cyrus to allow his people to go back and start to rebuild the temple. So now, in this week's lesson, we have King Darius, who is now the Persian king. He ascended to the throne after several years after Cyrus. And what I love about this, because this is such a powerful illustration of the sovereign power of God, because not only did he use Cyrus, but he picked it up with Darius. So what this says to me, it doesn't matter who's voted into office. It doesn't matter who ascends to the throne, that God is still in control and that he can use anyone that he wants to use. And that's so important to understand because, as I said last week, sometimes we get stuck, right, in the four walls of the church. And we think that God is only in our churches and he only uses the people in our churches. And that's just not true. God is the God of the entire universe, okay? I'm not even going to say the entire earth, the entire universe. All of the planets, everything is in alignment. You know, we're approaching the vernal equinox where the sun and the moon and the earth are all in alignment. God is in control of all of those things. Think about that. These heavenly bodies are spinning and orbiting in space, and God has all of that in control. And when you think of the magnitude of God, you won't be afraid of a king or a president or a governor or a mayor or whomever it may be, because they are subject to God as well. And here's the thing about it: whether you choose to serve God, worship God, or not, you are always going to submit to the power of God, whether you know it or not, or whether you intend to or not. So that's something that is a really powerful part of this lesson. And so we see that Darius was here and he had made a decree. Now, he also went and he searched the records and he picked up the decree that was made by King Cyrus before him. And he talked about all of the things that they had, and they were able to go through. And I like these men. What I like about these men is that they were able to go through the treasures of the ruin of Babylon, right? And figure out what came from Jerusalem and what belonged in the house of God. And that was a very critical first step for them. So that's what Cyrus did. And he made this initial decree allowing them to go back. So now we have Darius here. And Darius, he's actually building on the foundation that Cyrus led. Okay, and he talked about this decree where he let them go back and he let them build the house and he let them offer the sacrifices and all of this. So now he's saying, this is what I want you to do. I want you, when you build this temple, build it on a strong foundation, right? And he told them how tall to make it, 80 cubits. And he told them how wide to make it. He gave them the specifics. And he told them with 3 rows of great stones and all of these things. So now you have the width. And then he also wants to put this valuable stuff in there, right? Great stones, 3 rows of great stones. Then he talked about new timber, right? And let the expenses be given out of the king's house. Look at this, because He's not just saying go and get something from any old peasant's house or dig up anything from anywhere. This is going to come from the king's house. If it's coming from the king's house, that means it's going to be the best of the best. So that is what he told them to do. And he told them about the golden and silver vessels, because again, when the vessels were taken out of the house of God by the Babylonians, they were desecrated. And at this point, he's saying to go back and restore them. They had to be restored, they had to be consecrated in order to be fit to use in the temple and the house of God. And then there were people, as always, governors there who had something to say about it. What are you doing here? Who gave you authority to be here? All of those things. And they were able to go back. And that's, I kind of touched on this last week about the fact that these men decreed these things, right? They issued declarations, not only proclamations, but declarations which were recorded in writing, all right? They had letters from these men. They had they had a scroll from Cyrus, and they had a letter from Darius authorizing them. See, when God sends you someplace, you're going to be validated. So he said, let the work of this house, verse 7, let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. Just type in the comments, God will make the devil leave you alone. I just felt that, because when you're trying to build and when you're trying to do the work of the Lord, there will be opposition. But this verse right here says, let the work of this house of God alone, leave them alone, let them build. And that's what we see here. And so now it says that when they were in need, whatever they were in need of, and get this, not only did Darius provide them with everything that they need, all the money, he gave them the animals for the sacrifice to make sure that they could worship God, freed to worship. And that's what he went. And then he went on with a decree to issue a warning saying that this is what I have said is going to be done, right? And if anyone should come against it, they are going to be punished, because these people are free to worship. And this lesson really, really blessed me, because there will always be a challenge, a trial, or something, And what I love about this is that they could not be stopped from worshiping by the past, the history of them being taken away into Babylonian captivity. They couldn't be stopped by the current situation of them being challenged, and they could not be stopped by any future situations, because the decree was made that if anybody bothers you, that they will be punished. And that's just a threefold protection, right? Divine freedom and protection that God has given us. Now, I do want to go to the lesson review. It talks about the golden text, or the scripture that you like. As you can probably guess, the one I like is 7. I'm going to read it one more time to go in there and to enter that box. Let the work of this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place. That's my favorite scripture right there, because I am definitely a builder by nature. It's in my DNA. My family, we're builders. So I'm always doing something. And if you're always doing something, it's always going to be opposition. And this verse right here stood out at me, because it told me that the devil is going to have to leave me alone. If I were to take a text from this scripture, it would be, you're going to have to leave me alone. All right. So the next one, compare and contrast yourself to one of the characters in the lesson. I would like to compare myself. Well, there's a couple, but I'm going to choose Darius. And I'm going to choose Darius because, first of all, I am a researcher. I'm very careful about making sure that whatever I say is accurate. And I believe you're supposed to know what you're talking about and know what you're doing. So I appreciate the fact that Darius went back and found this scroll from Cyrus so that he could know everything that was going on. He knew the history of how they were brought into Nebuchadnezzar. He made sure he knew what actually belonged to the children of Israel, and what actually belonged in the temple. So I love that one. So I would compare myself to Darius in terms of going back, getting the details, and then doing the right thing and continuing the work. Areas for me to apply this lesson this week, I'm going to actively pursue opportunities to worship, to be grateful for the freedom that God has given me, and understand that the freedom to worship comes from God, and make God's worship a priority over everything else. So that's how I'm going to apply this lesson this week.